The
This
black
isn't what we
limousine pulled up
discussed.
to Martha's diner at 7 a.m. on a
Page
Monday
7,
morning,
Section
just
3.
as Maya was wiping
says
down
right
the
here-
last table of her overnight shift. Men in dark suits stepped out, their polished leather shoes touching the cracked sidewalk with the kind of precision that meant business. Maya gripped the worn silver bracelet tighter, the last gift from Henry before he passed away the week before. One of them opened a briefcase, pulling out a thick folder. "Maya Rodriguez, we represent Whitmore and Associates. Henry Blackstone left you something in his will." Maya felt the air in the diner freeze. The truth about the man she'd cared for over 3 years was about to change her life forever. We wonder where you're watching from tonight, because maybe you've met someone like her, someone who changed everything with one small act. Maya had no idea that serving coffee and pie to a lonely old man would lead her into the boardrooms of corporate America, where she'd face down corruption that had been bleeding millions from those who needed help most. The fluorescent lights of Martha's diner hummed their familiar tune at 2:30 a.m., casting harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floors that Maya Rodriguez had mopped countless times over the past 4 years. She moved through her routine with practiced efficiency, refilling the coffee machine and checking that the pie case was stocked for the morning rush. At 28, Maya had the kind of tiredness that came not from one long shift, but from the weight of carrying too much responsibility on shoulders that weren't quite wide enough for it all. Her mother's insulin cost $240 a month. Her 16-year-old sister needed new textbooks for her AP classes, and the $47,000 in student loan debt from her incomplete business degree sat in her inbox like a ticking bomb, demanding payments she could barely scrape together. The bell above the door chimed at exactly 11:15 p.m., just like it had every Friday night for the past 3 years. Henry Blackstone shuffled in wearing the same faded brown coat, his silver hair combed neatly despite the late hour, carrying himself with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to navigate the world alone. He never needed to order. Maya already had his black coffee brewing and was cutting a slice of cherry pie before he reached his usual corner booth, the one where he could watch the parking lot through the window while keeping his back to the wall. There was something about the way Henry observed everything around him, the way his eyes tracked movement and his fingers drummed silent patterns on the table, that suggested he hadn't always been just a regular customer at a small-town diner. "Rough night, Maya?" Henry asked, noting the way she rubbed her temples as she set down his coffee. His voice carried the faintest trace of an accent, something European that became more pronounced when he was tired or when he took those occasional phone calls in what sounded like German. Maya had learned not to ask questions about Henry's past, just like she'd learned that he always paid in cash, always tipped exactly 20%, and always left before the morning rush began. Tonight, though, something felt different. His hands shook slightly as he reached for his wallet, and when he pulled out the bills, Maya noticed a small scar on his wrist that was usually hidden by his sleeve, a precise, surgical mark that looked nothing like an accident. "Same as always," Maya replied, though that wasn't entirely true. The collection notices were piling up. Her mother's doctor wanted to discuss alternative treatment options, which was code for cheaper medications that didn't work as well. And her sister had stopped talking about college because they both knew the math didn't add up. Maya had started picking up extra shifts at the local grocery store during the day, which meant she was running on about 4 hours of sleep and enough caffeine to power a small city. She watched Henry take his first sip of coffee, always the same ritual. 3 small sips followed by a longer drink, and noticed he was studying her face more intently than usual, as if he was trying to memorize something. "Maya," Henry said quietly, setting down his cup with deliberate care. "You've been kind to me these past 3 years, kinder than you needed to be." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small silver bracelet, its surface worn smooth but engraved with the initials HB and the words, "For kindness beyond measure." Maya started to protest. She couldn't accept gifts from customers, and besides, Henry didn't look like he had money to spare for jewelry. But he held up a hand to stop her. "My grandmother gave this to me when I was your age. She told me to give it to someone who understood that treating people with dignity costs nothing but is worth everything." The weight of the bracelet in Maya's palm felt substantial, real in a way that made her throat tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. The diner felt different after Henry left that night, though Maya couldn't put her finger on why. She finished her closing routine, counted the register, and drove home through the empty streets of Millbrook, Ohio, where the biggest excitement was usually the Friday night football games and the annual corn festival. The silver bracelet sat on her nightstand as she tried to catch a few hours of sleep before her grocery store shift, its presence somehow both comforting and unsettling. Maya had no way of knowing that Henry Blackstone had spent the last 3 years not just enjoying her coffee and conversation, but watching her handle difficult customers with grace, stretch every dollar to help her family, and treat everyone, from the homeless veteran who sometimes came in for free coffee to the businessman who left terrible tips, with the same quiet respect. When Maya got the call from Martha the following Friday that Henry had passed away peacefully in his sleep, she felt the loss settle into her chest like a physical weight. She'd served hundreds of customers over the years, but Henry had become something more, a constant in her unpredictable world, proof that kindness could exist without expectation of return. Maya wore the silver bracelet to his funeral, a small service at Millbrook Community Church where she was surprised to see how few people attended. The pastor spoke in generalities about a man who valued privacy and lived quietly, which struck Maya as odd for someone who had clearly touched lives deeply enough to leave meaningful gifts to virtual strangers. The black limousine arrived exactly 1 week after Henry's funeral, just as Maya was finishing her overnight shift and looking forward to sleeping past noon, for the first time in months. The sight of it parked outside Martha's diner was so incongruous, like finding a diamond ring in a box of cereal, that Maya wondered if she was hallucinating from exhaustion. When the men in dark suits stepped out and asked for her by name, Maya's first thought was that somehow she'd made a mistake, missed a payment, or violated some rule she didn't even know existed. The silver bracelet felt heavy on her wrist as she followed them outside, where the early morning sun caught the limousine's polished surface and turned it into a mirror that reflected everything Maya thought she knew about her simple, predictable life back at her in fragments. The offices of Whitmore and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower in downtown Cleveland, the kind of building where Maya felt like her 4-year-old Honda Civic was embarrassing the parking garage just by existing in it. She sat in the reception area trying not to fidget with the silver bracelet, while surrounded by leather furniture that probably cost more than she made in 6 months, and abstract art that looked like expensive accidents. The receptionist, a woman about Maya's age with the kind of polish that came from never having to choose between buying groceries and paying the electric bill, had offered her coffee in a tone that suggested Maya might not know what coffee was, which almost made her laugh, given that she'd probably brewed more coffee in the past year than this woman had consumed in her lifetime. Margaret Whitmore turned out to be a woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon, and the kind of steady gaze that suggested she'd seen everything corporate America had to offer and wasn't impressed by most of it. Her office overlooked the city, and Maya could see the Cuyahoga River winding through downtown like a ribbon of determination, carrying boats and debris toward Lake Erie with equal indifference. "Miss Rodriguez," Mrs. Whitmore began, settling behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of mahogany. "I'm going to tell you something that will probably seem impossible, so I'd like you to listen carefully before you respond." She opened a folder thick enough to choke a horse and pulled out documents that had the weight and formality of government treaties. "The man you knew as Henry Blackstone was Henry Wilhelm Blackstone, founder and chief executive officer of Blackstone Industries," Mrs. Whitmore continued, watching Maya's face for any sign of recognition. "The company manufactures medical equipment, ventilators, surgical instruments, diagnostic machines, and has annual revenues of approximately $150 million. Maya felt like someone had just told her that her next-door neighbor was secretly the Pope, or that her grocery store manager was actually running NASA on the side. Henry Blackstone, the man who counted out exact change for coffee and pie, who wore the same brown coat every Friday and asked about her mother's health with genuine concern, owned a company worth more money than Maya could properly comprehend. The inheritance itself was even more impossible than Henry's secret identity. 15% ownership in Blackstone Industries, which Mrs. Whitmore calculated as approximately $2.3 million in current value, plus oversight responsibility for the Blackstone Foundation, which distributed charitable funds throughout Ohio and surrounding states. "There is one condition," Mrs. Whitmore said, sliding another set of documents across the desk. "You must work for Blackstone Industries for a minimum of 1 year in the position of Community Relations Specialist, with a starting salary of $65,000 annually, plus benefits." Maya stared at the numbers until they started to swim on the page, trying to process the idea that her student loan debt could disappear overnight, that her mother could afford the best insulin available, that her sister could attend any college she wanted without Maya having to work herself into an early grave to pay for it. "Why me?" Maya asked, because none of this made sense in any universe she understood. She was a waitress with an incomplete business degree and a talent for stretching $15 into a week's worth of groceries, not someone who belonged in boardrooms making decisions about millions of dollars. Mrs. Whitmore smiled for the first time since Maya had entered the office, an expression that transformed her stern features into something almost maternal. "According to Henry's notes, you possessed something he'd been looking for his entire business career: integrity that couldn't be bought, sold, or compromised by circumstances. He spent 3 years watching you treat every person who walked into that diner with dignity, regardless of how they treated you or how much money they had in their pockets." The lawyer pulled out a handwritten letter, Henry's familiar, careful script covering 2 pages of legal stationery. "Maya has the rare gift of seeing people as human beings rather than transactions," Mrs. Whitmore read aloud. "She never asked me for anything beyond courtesy and conversation despite clearly struggling financially. She defended customers from harassment, shared her employee meal with someone who couldn't pay, and worked extra hours without complaint to help her family. If she can bring that perspective to Blackstone Industries, perhaps we can remember that business exists to serve people, not the other way around." Maya felt tears gathering in her eyes as she listened to Henry's words, remembering all the small moments she'd thought were just part of doing her job. The night she'd stayed late to help an elderly customer call his son, the time she'd refused to let a drunk businessman harass the young couple in the corner booth, the countless conversations about everything and nothing that had made Henry's Friday visits something she looked forward to. Mrs. Whitmore explained the practical details with the efficiency of someone who'd handled stranger inheritances than this one, though probably not many. Maya would start work the following Monday, reporting to the executive team that currently consisted of Chief Financial Officer Richard Thornton and Chief Operating Officer Patricia Mills, both of whom had been informed about the inheritance but not necessarily pleased by it. "Henry was very specific about your role," the lawyer added, pulling out organizational charts and job descriptions. "You'll be evaluating the effectiveness of Blackstone's current charitable giving and community outreach programs, with full access to financial records and the authority to recommend changes. He seemed to think the foundation had gotten away from its original mission and needed someone with fresh eyes to examine where the money was actually going." The ride back to Millbrook in Maya's Honda felt surreal, like she was driving through someone else's life wearing someone else's clothes. She kept glancing at the briefcase full of documents Mrs. Whitmore had given her: corporate bylaws, foundation guidelines, organizational charts that looked like family trees for businesses, and wondering if she was going to wake up back in the diner with a pot of coffee in her hand and reality restored to its normal, predictable parameters. The silver bracelet caught the afternoon sunlight as she gripped the steering wheel, and Maya thought about Henry sitting in that corner booth, watching her navigate the small dramas and daily kindnesses that make up a life lived paycheck to paycheck, somehow seeing in her the qualities needed to oversee millions of dollars in charitable giving. That evening, Maya called her mother and sister and tried to explain what had happened without making it sound like she'd lost her mind or won the lottery through some cosmic mistake. Her mother cried, which was expected, and her sister demanded to know if this meant she could finally take AP Chemistry without Maya having to pick up a third job, which was also expected. What Maya didn't expect was the feeling of responsibility settling onto her shoulders like a coat that was too big and too heavy. The understanding that Henry's gift came with expectations that went far beyond just showing up and collecting a paycheck. She fell asleep that night clutching the documents from Mrs. Whitmore's office, dreaming about boardrooms and foundation meetings and the weight of decisions that could affect hundreds of people she'd never met. All while the silver bracelet pressed against her wrist like a reminder that some gifts come with the obligation to become worthy of them. Blackstone Industries occupied a modern campus on the outskirts of Cleveland. All glass and steel and landscaping that looked like someone had hired a team of scientists to determine the exact shade of green that conveyed trustworthy prosperity. Maya's Honda looked like a refugee from a demolition derby in the parking lot full of German sedans and American luxury vehicles. But she walked toward the main entrance with the same determination that had gotten her through 4 years of overnight shifts and a semester of organic chemistry. The lobby was all marble and indirect lighting, with a wall display showing the company's charitable contributions over the past decade, photographs of medical clinics in rural communities, scholarship recipients at graduation ceremonies, disaster relief efforts where Blackstone equipment had helped save lives during floods and tornadoes. Richard Thornton turned out to be a man in his early 50s with the kind of artificially white teeth that suggested either excellent genetics or expensive dentistry, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Maya made in a month at Martha's Diner. His handshake was firm but brief, like someone checking off a box on a list of professional obligations, and his office looked like it had been decorated by someone who'd read a book about what powerful people's offices should look like. Leather-bound books that showed no signs of being read, awards from organizations Maya had never heard of, and a putting green that seemed to exist mainly to demonstrate that he had enough space to waste some of it on indoor golf. "Miss Rodriguez," Thornton began, settling behind a desk that could have doubled as a landing strip for small aircraft. "I want to assure you that despite the unusual circumstances of your arrival here, we're committed to making your transition as smooth as possible." He spoke with the careful diction of someone who'd learned to reveal nothing through inflection, every word measured and professionally neutral. "Your office is on the 3rd floor, with full access to our financial systems and foundation records. Patricia Mills, our Chief Operating Officer, will coordinate with you on day-to-day operations." There was something in the way he said "unusual circumstances" that suggested Maya's presence was about as welcome as a health inspector at a restaurant with a rat problem. Patricia Mills proved to be a woman in her 40s with auburn hair, and the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes, the expression of someone who'd learned to navigate corporate politics by revealing nothing and trusting no one. Her office was smaller than Thornton's, but more personal, with photographs of a teenage daughter and certificates from various business leadership programs covering one wall. "Your role is essentially to audit our charitable giving," she explained, walking Maya through corridors lined with framed patents and industry awards. The Blackstone Foundation distributes approximately $3.2 million annually to 47 different organizations throughout Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. Your job is to evaluate whether those funds are being used effectively and make recommendations for improvement. Maya's new office turned out to be a converted conference room on the 3rd floor, with a view of the parking lot and access to a computer system that seemed designed by people who believed that making something difficult to use somehow made it more secure. The foundation records were stored in filing cabinets that looked like they'd been organized by someone with a serious filing system obsession. Every document categorized and cross-referenced with the precision of a military operation. Maya spent her first morning reviewing grant applications and financial reports, trying to understand the landscape of charitable giving in a region where economic opportunity was often separated by hundreds of miles and decades of industrial decline. The numbers told a story that was both encouraging and puzzling. Blackstone Foundation supported organizations ranging from rural health clinics to urban literacy programs, from disaster relief efforts to scholarship funds for first-generation college students. The grant amounts varied from $5,000 for small community programs to nearly $500,000 for major initiatives. And on the surface, everything looked exactly like what Maya would expect from a well-managed charitable foundation. It wasn't until she started cross-referencing grant recipients with their actual locations and contact information that the first red flags began to appear. Organizations that existed only as post office boxes, websites that looked like they'd been built by high school students, and financial reports that were either missing or so vaguely written that they could have been describing any organization anywhere. Jennifer Walsh turned out to be Maya's most valuable resource during those first confusing weeks. A financial assistant in her 30s who'd been with Blackstone for 8 years and had the institutional memory that comes from actually caring about the work rather than just collecting a paycheck. Jennifer had the kind of quiet competence that kept organizations running smoothly, while the executives took credit for everything that went right and blamed someone else for everything that went wrong. "There's something I think you should know," Jennifer said one afternoon, closing Maya's office door and speaking in the careful tone of someone who'd learned that corporate walls had ears. "A lot of things changed around here after Henry got sick. Decisions that used to require board approval started getting made in executive meetings, and some of the foundation grants started going to organizations that nobody had ever heard of." Over coffee in the break room, Jennifer walked Maya through her concerns with the methodical precision of someone who'd been documenting problems without having anyone to report them to. Several organizations that received substantial grants had minimal online presence and mailing addresses that led to commercial mail forwarding services, which wasn't necessarily suspicious but was unusual for legitimate charities. The approval process for these grants seemed to bypass the normal oversight procedures, with Thornton and Mills co-signing authorization letters without the board review that was supposed to be required for grants over $25,000. "I tried to bring this up with Henry a few months before he died," Jennifer continued, "but he was already pretty sick, and Thornton said they'd handle the oversight internally until Henry recovered." Maya spent the next week digging deeper into the foundation records, cross-referencing grant recipients with state charity registrations and federal tax filings. What she found was a pattern that made her stomach sink with the same feeling she'd had as a kid when she realized the math on her family's bills didn't add up to what her mother said they could afford. 8 organizations that had received a total of $1.8 million over the past 4 years existed primarily on paper. They had the required legal paperwork to qualify as nonprofits, but no physical locations, no staff directories, and no programs that anyone could verify actually existed. The Midwest Health Research Institute, which had received $480,000 to study rural healthcare access, operated out of a post office box in Delaware and had never published any research or issued any reports on its supposed activities. The more Maya investigated, the clearer it became that someone had created an elaborate shell game designed to siphon money from legitimate charitable purposes into accounts that disappeared into the labyrinthine world of corporate finance. Every fraudulent organization followed the same pattern. Incorporation in Delaware, where business filings were minimal and privacy protections were strong. Minimal web presence that looked legitimate enough to pass casual inspection. And financial reports that were just detailed enough to satisfy legal requirements while revealing absolutely nothing about where the money actually went. Maya had learned enough about business finances during her incomplete accounting degree to recognize money laundering when she saw it. And what she was seeing made her realize that Henry's gift wasn't just an inheritance. It was a responsibility to expose a theft that had been bleeding resources from people who needed help most. That night, Maya sat in her small apartment staring at spreadsheets and bank records until her eyes burned, trying to calculate how much money had been stolen from legitimate charities while she'd been serving coffee and worrying about her student loans. The silver bracelet felt heavier on her wrist as she began to understand the real reason Henry had chosen her. Not just because she was kind or trustworthy, but because she was someone who would care enough about the people being hurt by this fraud to do something about it, even if it meant taking on opponents with more money, power, and experience than she could ever hope to match. Maya fell asleep at her kitchen table surrounded by evidence of corporate theft, dreaming about the rural health clinics and literacy programs that could have changed lives with the money that had instead vanished into numbered accounts and offshore corporations that existed only to make rich people richer. Maya arrived at Blackstone Industries the next morning with the methodical focus of someone who'd spent years balancing books that never wanted to balance and making ends meet that fought every attempt to be tied together. Jennifer Walsh was waiting with coffee and the kind of nervous energy that came from finally having someone who might actually listen to concerns that had been building for months. They spread the foundation records across Maya's desk like investigators laying out evidence at a crime scene. which Maya was beginning to suspect wasn't too far from the truth. The morning sun streamed through the office windows, illuminating documents that told a story of systematic theft disguised as charitable giving. Each fraudulent grant carefully crafted to look legitimate while funneling money away from people who desperately needed it. The forensic accounting process that Maya had learned during her business degree turned out to be like riding a bicycle. Once she started tracking money through corporate structures and shell companies, the patterns became clear even after years away from the classroom. Every dollar that went into the Blackstone Foundation was supposed to come out helping people, but Maya's analysis showed that nearly 30% of the grants over the past 4 years had gone to organizations that existed only on paper. The Delaware incorporation records all led back to the same registered agent, a legal services company that specialized in helping businesses maintain their anonymity, and the bank accounts associated with these fake charities showed regular transfers to investment accounts that seemed designed specifically to make money disappear. Jennifer proved to be invaluable during this investigation, not just because she understood Blackstone's internal systems, but because she'd been documenting irregularities for months without having anyone in authority who was willing to listen. She'd copied emails, saved financial reports, and maintained detailed records of the approval process for grants that seemed to bypass normal oversight procedures. "Look at this," Jennifer said, pulling up email exchanges between Thornton and Mills that discussed streamlining the approval process for time-sensitive opportunities. The emails were carefully worded to sound like normal business efficiency, but when Maya cross-referenced the dates with grant approvals, it became clear that time-sensitive opportunities was code for fraudulent organizations that needed money moved quickly before anyone could ask too many questions. The breakthrough came when Maya discovered that Henry Blackstone had been conducting his own investigation before his illness became too severe to continue. Hidden in his personal computer files, protected by encryption software that would have impressed most cybersecurity professionals, were detailed financial analyses that tracked every suspicious grant back to its ultimate destination. Henry had identified not just the shell companies and fake charities, but the complex network of investment accounts and offshore entities that were being used to launder the stolen money. His notes showed that he'd been preparing to confront Thornton and Mills when his cancer diagnosis forced him to step back from day-to-day operations, leaving him to watch helplessly as the theft accelerated during his absence. Henry's encrypted files contained more than just financial evidence. They included copies of private communications between Thornton and Mills discussing their scheme with the casual confidence of people who believed they were too smart to get caught. The emails revealed that they'd been skimming foundation money for nearly 5 years, starting with small amounts that were unlikely to be noticed and gradually increasing their theft as they realized that Henry's focus on big-picture strategy meant he rarely examined individual grant details. They'd calculated that by the time Henry retired or died, they would have stolen enough money to ensure comfortable lives far from Ohio and any potential legal consequences. Maya spent the next week building a comprehensive case that would satisfy both corporate lawyers and federal investigators, documenting every fraudulent transaction with the precision of someone who understood that rich people with expensive lawyers didn't go to prison based on hunches or incomplete evidence. She traced the money from Blackstone Foundation grants through shell companies and investment accounts to personal accounts belonging to Thornton and Mills, creating a paper trail that was as clear and undeniable as a roadmap. The total amount stolen over 5 years was $7.2 million, money that should have funded rural health clinics, literacy programs, disaster relief efforts, and scholarship opportunities for first-generation college students like Maya herself. The emotional weight of what she discovered hit Maya hardest when she calculated how many people had been hurt by this theft. $7.2 million could have provided health care to thousands of rural families, funded college educations for hundreds of deserving students, or supported dozens of community programs that helped people build better lives for themselves and their children. Instead, that money had been used to pay for luxury vacations, investment properties, and the kind of lifestyle upgrades that rich people convinced themselves they deserved, simply because they were smart enough to steal without getting caught immediately. As Maya prepared to confront Thornton and Mills with her evidence, she found herself thinking about Henry Blackstone sitting in that corner booth at Martha's Diner, watching her treat every customer with dignity while secretly planning to entrust her with the power to expose the people who were stealing from the charitable foundation he'd built to help others. The silver bracelet felt warm against her wrist as she realized that Henry hadn't just given her an inheritance. He'd given her the opportunity to become the person she'd always had the potential to be. Someone who could stand up to power and wealth and corruption, armed with nothing more than the truth and the courage to speak it. Even when the consequences were uncertain and the opponents had every advantage except moral authority. Maya worked through the night preparing her presentation, knowing that she was about to step into a confrontation that would determine not just her own future, but the futures of thousands of people who would benefit from Blackstone Foundation grants if she could expose the theft and restore the money to its intended purposes. The documents spread across her desk represented more than evidence of corporate crime. They represented the difference between hope and despair for rural communities that desperately needed health care, for students who dreamed of college educations, and for families facing medical emergencies that could bankrupt them without charitable assistance. Maya fell asleep at her desk, surrounded by the tools she would need to hold powerful people accountable for their actions, dreaming about justice that came not from fairy tale magic, but from careful investigation, moral courage, and the determination to ensure that people who steal from those who need help most face consequences that match the harm they've caused. Maya scheduled the meeting with Thornton and Mills for Friday afternoon, choosing the same day of the week when Henry used to visit Martha's diner, as if his presence might somehow give her courage for what she was about to do. The executive conference room on Blackstone's 4th floor was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Cleveland's skyline, a mahogany table that could seat 20 people, and leather chairs that cost more than most families' monthly rent. Maya arrived early and arranged her evidence methodically across the table, transforming the corporate showroom into something closer to a prosecutor's office. Each document and financial record positioned to tell the story of systematic theft with mathematical precision. Thornton entered first, carrying himself with the confident stride of someone who'd never faced serious consequences for any of his actions, followed by Mills, whose expression suggested she was already calculating exit strategies and damage control scenarios. They settled into chairs across from Maya with the casual authority of people who were accustomed to being the most powerful people in any room. But Maya noticed that Mills kept glancing at the documents spread across the table with the nervous attention of someone who recognized her own handwriting on incriminating emails. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me," Maya began, her voice steady despite her heart beating fast enough to power a small generator. "I've discovered some irregularities in our foundation grants that I think you'll want to address immediately." The presentation Maya had prepared was devastating in its simplicity. Bank records that showed money flowing from legitimate grants into shell companies, incorporation documents that revealed the same registered agent for multiple fake charities, and email exchanges between Thornton and Mills that discussed their scheme with the kind of casual detail that would make federal prosecutors weep with joy. Maya walked them through each piece of evidence methodically, watching their faces change from professional courtesy to growing alarm as they realized how comprehensively their theft had been documented. Over the past 5 years, approximately $7.2 million has been diverted from the Blackstone Foundation to accounts controlled by organizations that exist only on paper, Maya concluded, placing the final financial summary in front of them like a judge pronouncing sentence. Thornton recovered first, as Maya had expected from someone who'd spent decades in corporate boardrooms where the first rule was never admit anything that could be used against you later. "Miss Rodriguez, these are serious allegations based on what appears to be incomplete financial analysis," he said, his voice carrying the patronizing tone of someone explaining reality to a child who'd gotten confused about how the world actually worked. "Shell companies are standard business practice for managing complex charitable distributions, and the organizations you're questioning are legitimate nonprofits that have been vetted through our normal approval process." He gestured at the documents with the dismissive wave of someone brushing away an annoying insect, but Maya noticed that his hand trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. Mills tried a different approach, leaning forward with the kind of concerned expression that suggested Maya might be having some sort of emotional breakdown that could be managed through professional counseling and possibly medication. Maya, I understand that adjusting to corporate finance can be overwhelming, especially coming from your background, she said, her voice dripping with the fake sympathy that rich people used when they wanted to sound caring while actually being condescending. These transactions follow standard accounting procedures that might seem irregular to someone without extensive experience in corporate charitable operations. Perhaps we should schedule some additional training to help you understand how foundation grants actually work. The implication that Maya was too stupid or inexperienced to understand what she discovered was almost insulting enough to make her laugh. Maya had anticipated both of their responses and was prepared with the kind of evidence that couldn't be dismissed through corporate doublespeak or professional condescension. I also have the encrypted files that Henry Blackstone maintained during his own investigation of these irregularities, she said, placing copies of Henry's financial analysis and personal notes in front of them, like cards in a poker game where she held all the aces. He documented every fraudulent transaction, traced the money to its ultimate destinations, and prepared a comprehensive case that includes your private communications about the scheme. Henry knew exactly what you were doing, and he left me with the evidence and legal authority to ensure that justice is served. The color drained from Mills's face as she recognized her own words in the email printouts. Communications that had seemed safe when they were buried in corporate computer systems but now sat on a conference table like smoking guns. The room fell silent except for the soft hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic on the streets below, where normal people were going about their lives without having to worry about corporate executives stealing millions of dollars from charities. Maya watched Thornton and Mills exchange glances that communicated years of partnership in crime. The kind of wordless conversation that happens between people who've shared secrets that could destroy both their lives. "What do you want?" Thornton finally asked, abandoning his earlier pretense of innocence in favor of the kind of direct negotiation that happened between criminals when one of them had been caught with their hand in the cash register. Maya had thought carefully about this moment, understanding that her next words would determine not just the outcome of this confrontation, but the future of everyone who depended on Blackstone Foundation grants for healthcare, education, and emergency assistance. "I want full restitution of the stolen money, your immediate resignations, and your cooperation in restructuring the foundation to prevent this from happening again," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who held all the cards and wasn't interested in negotiating. "You have 48 hours to decide whether you want to handle this privately or explain your actions to federal investigators, the state attorney general, and the board of directors who trusted you to manage charitable funds responsibly." The ultimatum hung in the air between them like a sword that could fall in either direction, depending on whether they chose honor or continued deception. Mills cracked first, as Maya had suspected she might, based on Jennifer's observations about her growing nervousness over the past few months. "Richard, maybe we should consider," she began. But Thornton cut her off with a sharp gesture that suggested their partnership was dissolving under pressure like sugar in hot coffee. "We're not discussing anything until we've consulted with our attorneys," Thornton said, standing up with the rigid posture of someone trying to maintain dignity while their world collapsed around them. "Miss Rodriguez, I think you'll find that corporate law is more complex than whatever amateur investigation you think you've conducted here." But Maya could hear the fear beneath his bluster, the understanding that rich people with expensive lawyers still went to prison when the evidence was overwhelming, and the crimes were too serious to be dismissed as accounting errors. Maya gathered her documents with the calm efficiency of someone who'd accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do, knowing that she'd given Thornton and Mills enough rope to hang themselves with, and that their next moves would determine whether they faced private consequences or very public criminal prosecution. The silver bracelet caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the conference room windows as she closed her briefcase, and Maya thought about Henry Blackstone sitting in Martha's diner, quietly planning this moment when justice would finally catch up with people who believed their wealth and position made them untouchable. She walked out of that conference room knowing that the scared, desperate people she'd left behind would spend the weekend trying to figure out how to escape consequences that had been building for 5 years. while she prepared for the board meeting that would determine whether Blackstone Industries could redeem itself or whether federal prosecutors would have to handle the cleanup of one of Ohio's largest corporate charity frauds. The Blackstone Industries boardroom on Monday morning looked like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided, but the sentencing was still pending. 9 directors sat around the mahogany table with the grim expressions of people who'd spent their weekend reviewing financial documents that revealed how thoroughly they'd been betrayed by executives they'd trusted with their reputations and the company's charitable mission. Maya had arrived early to set up her presentation, transforming the corporate conference room into something closer to a prosecutor's office, with easels displaying financial charts and evidence boxes containing 5 years' worth of documentation that told the story of systematic theft with mathematical precision. Richard Thornton entered the room carrying himself like a general, preparing for a battle he knew he couldn't win, flanked by 2 lawyers who looked like they charged more per hour than most people made in a month. Patricia Mills followed with the hollow expression of someone who'd spent the weekend realizing that her comfortable life was about to be replaced by legal bills, public humiliation, and possible federal prison time. They took seats at the far end of the table from Maya, creating a physical distance that emphasized the moral chasm between someone who'd been stealing from charity and someone who'd risked everything to expose the theft. Board Chairman Robert Fletcher called the meeting to order with the formal gravity of someone presiding over a funeral, which in many ways he was. This was the death of trust, reputation, and the illusion that corporate executives could police themselves without independent oversight. We're here to address allegations of financial irregularities in the Blackstone Foundation brought to our attention by Miss Rodriguez, Fletcher began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that the next few hours would determine whether Blackstone Industries survived this scandal or became another cautionary tale about corporate greed. Miss Rodriguez, you have the floor to present your findings. Maya had spent years watching people present information to hostile audiences, customers complaining about cold coffee, managers deflecting responsibility for scheduling mistakes, politicians promising solutions they had no intention of delivering. And she'd learned that the truth spoken clearly and backed by evidence was more powerful than any amount of charm or manipulation. She walked the board through her investigation with the methodical precision of someone who understood that rich people's lawyers specialized in finding technical loopholes that could transform obvious guilt into reasonable doubt. Every fraudulent transaction was documented. Every shell company was traced to its ultimate ownership. Every stolen dollar was accounted for with the kind of detail that would satisfy both corporate auditors and federal prosecutors. Thornton's defense was exactly what Maya had expected. A combination of technical legal arguments, personal attacks on her qualifications, and attempts to characterize systematic theft as accounting errors that had been blown out of proportion by someone who didn't understand corporate finance. Ms. Rodriguez has conducted an amateur investigation based on incomplete information and fundamental misunderstandings about how complex charitable operations function, he argued, his lawyers nodding along like backup singers in a performance that everyone knew was doomed to failure. These transactions follow standard practices for managing large-scale charitable distributions, and any suggestion of impropriety is based on inexperience rather than evidence. Maya had anticipated this response and was prepared with the kind of rebuttal that couldn't be dismissed through corporate doublespeak or character assassination. Mr. Thornton is correct that I lack extensive experience in corporate finance, she began, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who'd done her homework and wasn't intimidated by lawyers who charged more per minute than she used to make per hour. However, Henry Blackstone had decades of experience in corporate finance, and his encrypted files contain a comprehensive analysis that reaches the same conclusions I've presented today. Henry knew about this theft, documented it meticulously, and prepared the evidence that makes denial impossible. She placed copies of Henry's financial analysis in front of each board member, watching their faces change as they realized that their founder had died knowing he'd been betrayed by the executives he'd trusted with his life's work. The evidence cascade that followed was devastating in its comprehensiveness. Email exchanges discussing the scheme, bank records showing money flowing from fake charities to personal accounts, incorporation documents revealing the shell company network, and financial projections that showed how Thornton and Mills had planned to steal enough money to ensure comfortable retirements funded by theft from people who desperately needed charitable assistance. Board member Sarah Chen asked the question that everyone was thinking: how much money are we talking about? Maya had prepared for this moment, understanding that numbers made abstract crimes concrete and personal. $7.2 million over 5 years, diverted from legitimate charitable purposes to accounts controlled by Mr. Thornton and Mr. Mills. The silence that followed felt like the moment after a car accident when everyone realizes how close they came to dying and how different their lives are about to become. Maya watched the board members absorbing the magnitude of the theft, understanding that $7.2 million represented hundreds of rural families who could have received health care, thousands of students who could have attended college, and dozens of communities that could have received emergency assistance during natural disasters. Patricia Mills finally broke the silence with the kind of confession that happens when denial becomes impossible and cooperation becomes the only path to reduced consequences. "I want to make this right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have records of where the money went, and I'm willing to cooperate fully with restitution efforts." Maya's recommendation to the board was comprehensive and focused on restoration rather than revenge. Immediate termination of Thornton and Mills, full restitution of stolen funds, restructuring of foundation oversight to prevent future fraud, and implementation of community advisory boards to ensure that charitable grants actually serve their intended purposes. She'd learned enough about corporate governance to understand that punishment without systematic change was just theater, and her goal was protecting future charitable recipients rather than satisfying desires for revenge against people who'd already destroyed their own lives through greed and stupidity. The board vote was unanimous in ways that surprised even Maya. 7 votes for immediate termination, 7 votes for full cooperation with law enforcement, 7 votes for accepting Maya's restructuring recommendations, and 7 votes for promoting her to Director of Foundation Operations with full authority to rebuild the charitable giving program according to principles that Henry Blackstone would have approved. As she gathered her evidence and prepared to leave the boardroom, Maya thought about Henry sitting in that corner booth at Martha's Diner, somehow knowing that the shy waitress who brought him coffee and pie every Friday night had the courage and competence needed to hold powerful people accountable for their actions when accountability finally became unavoidable. Maya's first day as Director of Foundation Operations began with a phone call from the Ohio Attorney General's office, where prosecutors were reviewing the evidence she'd assembled and calculating whether criminal charges were worth pursuing against executives who'd already agreed to full restitution and public humiliation. The conversation was professional but encouraging. The state was pleased to see corporate self-policing that actually worked, and they were willing to accept civil penalties rather than criminal prosecution as long as every stolen dollar was returned and systematic changes were implemented to prevent future fraud. Maya hung up feeling like she'd navigated her first major test of leadership, balancing justice with practicality in ways that served the public interest rather than satisfying desires for revenge. The settlement negotiations with Thornton and Mills unfolded over the next 2 months with the mechanical efficiency of corporate lawyers who understood that their clients had been caught red-handed and were lucky to avoid federal prison. Maya worked with Blackstone's legal team to trace every stolen dollar through shell companies and investment accounts, recovering $6.8 million of the $7.2 million that had been diverted from legitimate charitable purposes. The remaining $400,000 had been spent on luxury vacations and lifestyle upgrades that couldn't be recovered. But Maya was satisfied that justice had been served and that future charitable recipients would benefit from the recovered funds. Rebuilding the Blackstone Foundation required more than just recovering stolen money. It meant creating oversight systems that would prevent future fraud while ensuring that legitimate charitable organizations could still receive grants efficiently and effectively. Maya worked with Jennifer Walsh, who'd been promoted to compliance officer, to establish community advisory boards in each region where the foundation operated, bringing together local leaders who understood their community's needs and could evaluate grant applications with knowledge that no corporate executive could match. The advisory boards included teachers, healthcare workers, social service providers, and community organizers who understood the difference between organizations that actually helped people and those that existed only on paper. The new grant application process that Maya designed emphasized transparency, accountability, and measurable outcomes in ways that protected both the foundation and legitimate charitable organizations. Every applicant had to provide detailed budgets, outcome measurements, and references from people who'd been served by their programs, while every approved grant included site visits, quarterly reports, and public disclosure of how funds were being used. The paperwork was more extensive than before, but Maya had learned from her investigation that a little extra documentation could prevent millions of dollars in theft, and most legitimate organizations welcomed oversight that demonstrated their effectiveness to potential donors and volunteers. Maya's first major initiative as foundation director was the Henry Blackstone Community Scholarship Program, designed to provide college funding for first-generation students from rural and urban communities that lacked educational opportunities. The program was personal for Maya. She understood what it meant to choose between family financial needs and educational dreams, and she wanted to ensure that other students never had to make that choice. The initial funding was $500,000, enough to provide full scholarships for 25 students, with plans to expand the program as foundation resources grew through improved efficiency and restored public trust. The scholarship selection process reflected Maya's values about fairness and opportunity. Academic achievement was important, but so were community service, personal resilience, and commitment to using education to help others. The first class of scholarship recipients included a young woman from rural West Virginia whose family had lost their farm to medical debt, a young man from inner-city Cleveland who'd started a literacy program for elementary students, and 23 other students whose stories reminded Maya that education could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities when people were given chances to develop their potential. Healthcare remained the foundation's largest funding priority, with particular emphasis on rural communities where hospitals had closed and medical specialists were hours away by car. Maya worked with the Ohio Rural Health Network to identify clinics that needed equipment upgrades, telemedicine capabilities, and funding for nurse practitioners who could provide primary care in communities that couldn't support full-time physicians. The foundation's 3-year commitment was $2.1 million, enough to improve healthcare access for approximately 15,000 people in communities that had been losing medical services for decades. 6 months after taking over as foundation director, Maya presented the board with a comprehensive report that demonstrated how systematic change could improve both efficiency and effectiveness in charitable giving. Foundation administrative costs had decreased from 12% to 8% of total grants through elimination of fraudulent organizations and improved oversight systems. Community satisfaction surveys showed that 93% of grant recipients felt that foundation support had meaningfully improved their ability to serve people in need. Most importantly, independent auditors confirmed that every foundation dollar was reaching its intended destination and producing measurable benefits for the communities Blackstone Industries was committed to serving. Maya celebrated these achievements quietly, understanding that successful foundation management wasn't about personal recognition, but about connecting resources with needs in ways that improved lives and strengthened communities. She thought about Henry Blackstone often during those first months as foundation director, imagining his satisfaction at seeing charitable funds finally reaching their intended recipients without being filtered through shell companies and fake organizations designed to enrich people who already had more money than they could spend responsibly. The silver bracelet that Henry had given her felt lighter now, as if the weight of unfinished business had finally been lifted and replaced by the satisfaction of work that honored both his memory and the trust he'd placed in someone who'd proven worthy of the opportunity to make a difference. Jennifer Walsh proved to be an invaluable partner in rebuilding the foundation, bringing institutional knowledge and personal commitment to the work of ensuring that charitable giving actually served charitable purposes. Together, they created systems that balanced efficiency with accountability, transparency with privacy for grant recipients, and local knowledge with professional management standards. By the end of Maya's first year as foundation director, Blackstone Industries had become a model for corporate charitable giving that other companies were studying and attempting to replicate. Proof that business success and social responsibility could reinforce each other when leadership was committed to more than just profit maximization. Maya parked her new Honda, still a Honda, because some values didn't change with income, Outside Martha's diner on a Friday evening, exactly 2 years after receiving the inheritance that had transformed her life in ways she never could have imagined. The diner looked the same from the outside, with its neon sign flickering occasionally, and its parking lot full of pickup trucks and aging sedans belonging to people who worked hard for modest wages and found comfort in places that served decent food without pretension. Maya had called ahead to let Martha know she was coming, not as an employee, but as a customer who wanted to sit in a particular booth and remember someone who'd changed her life by seeing qualities in her that she hadn't known she possessed. The corner booth where Henry Blackstone used to sit every Friday night was empty, waiting for Maya like an old friend who'd saved her a seat. Martha brought coffee and cherry pie without being asked, along with the kind of smile that came from watching someone she'd worried about transform their life through courage and determination rather than luck or connections. "Look at you now," Martha said, settling into the booth across from Maya, with the familiarity of someone who'd watched her grow from a tired waitress into a confident professional who managed millions of dollars in charitable giving. "Henry would be proud of what you've accomplished, sweetheart. That man saw something special in you before anyone else did, including yourself." The diner's evening crowd was a mixture of familiar faces and strangers. Working people grabbing dinner between shifts, families celebrating small victories or commiserating over daily struggles, and the occasional traveler who discovered that Martha's diner served better food than most restaurants that charged 3 times as much. Maya watched the interactions between customers and staff with the appreciation of someone who understood how much skill and patience were required to serve the public with grace, especially when tips were small and customers were sometimes demanding. She thought about the scholarship recipients she'd met over the past 2 years, young people whose college educations were being funded by money that had been recovered from corporate thieves who'd tried to steal from the communities that needed help most. A new regular customer had discovered Henry's old booth, an elderly woman named Eleanor who came in every Tuesday evening and sat quietly reading paperback novels while nursing a single cup of coffee for hours. Maya had noticed her during previous visits and asked Martha about her story, learning that Eleanor was 82 years old, lived alone since her husband's death, and came to the diner because being around people was better than being alone in her apartment, even if she rarely spoke to anyone. Tonight, Maya made a decision that honored both Henry's memory and her own understanding of how small gestures could create connections that changed lives in unexpected ways. "Excuse me," Maya said, approaching Eleanor's table with the same gentle courtesy she'd learned from years of serving customers who just needed someone to treat them with dignity. "I'm Maya Rodriguez, and I used to work here. I noticed you reading. Would you mind if I bought your dinner tonight and maybe kept you company for a while?" Eleanor looked up from her book with the cautious expression of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of strangers offering unexpected kindness, but something in Maya's face must have convinced her that the offer was genuine. "That's very kind, dear. I'm Eleanor Patterson, and I'd enjoy the company more than the dinner, though I won't say no to both." Maya spent the next hour learning Eleanor's story, a retired teacher who'd spent 40 years in Cleveland public schools, a widow who'd lost her husband to cancer 3 years ago, and a woman who came to Martha's diner because the atmosphere reminded her of the community she'd built in her classroom over decades of helping students discover their potential. Eleanor had been using her teacher's pension to fund a small scholarship program for former students who wanted to attend college but couldn't afford tuition. And she'd been doing it quietly for 15 years without recognition or publicity because she believed education was the most important gift anyone could give to someone else. The conversation that followed felt like destiny disguised as coincidence, as Maya learned that Eleanor's scholarship program was exactly the kind of grassroots initiative that the restructured Blackstone Foundation was designed to support and amplify. By the time they finished dinner, Maya had invited Eleanor to serve on the Foundation's Community Advisory Board and proposed a partnership that would expand her scholarship program throughout Greater Cleveland, using Blackstone funding and Eleanor's knowledge of which students most needed and deserved educational opportunities. Eleanor accepted with tears in her eyes, understanding that her small acts of kindness were about to become part of something larger and more impactful than she'd ever imagined possible. As Maya prepared to leave the diner, she touched the silver bracelet that still lived on her wrist, now engraved with additional words that had been added to honor Henry's legacy. Legacy continues. HB 2023. The bracelet had become a reminder that kindness created ripples that spread far beyond the original act, connecting strangers across generations and circumstances in ways that couldn't be planned but could be recognized and honored when they occurred. Maya thought about the rural health clinics that were providing better care because of recovered foundation funds, the students attending college because theft had been exposed and prevented, and the communities that were stronger because someone had cared enough to hold powerful people accountable for their actions. Maya drove home through the streets of Millbrook, past the high school where her sister was now a senior with college acceptance letters and scholarship offers, past the medical clinic where her mother received diabetes care that was covered by improved insurance from Maya's foundation job, and past the small houses where people lived quiet lives of dignity and determination that deserved to be supported rather than exploited by those with more money and power. The work of running a foundation that distributed millions of dollars in charitable grants was challenging and occasionally overwhelming, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways that Maya hadn't experienced during her years of serving coffee and worrying about bills that never seemed to get smaller no matter how many extra shifts she worked. That night, Maya fell asleep thinking about the letter she'd received from Jennifer Walsh earlier that week, announcing that Blackstone Industries had been selected as Corporate Philanthropist of the Year by the Ohio Association of Nonprofits, recognition that reflected the systematic changes they'd implemented to ensure charitable funds reached their intended destinations. The award belonged to everyone who'd participated in rebuilding the foundation. Jennifer's diligent oversight, the Community Advisory Board's local knowledge, the scholarship recipients' academic achievements, and the healthcare workers who'd used foundation grants to improve medical care in communities that had been underserved for decades. Maya's role had been important, but the real success came from proving that business institutions could serve public purposes when leadership was committed to more than profit maximization and personal enrichment. Sometimes, kindness opens doors that power never could. And sometimes justice comes not from dramatic courtroom victories, but from quiet determination to ensure that people who steal from those who need help most face consequences that match the harm they've caused. Maya Rodriguez had learned both lessons during her transformation from waitress to foundation director, understanding that Henry Blackstone's greatest gift wasn't the inheritance that had changed her financial circumstances, but the trust that had revealed her capacity to become someone who could hold powerful people accountable while building systems that serve the common good rather than private greed. The end. Sometimes, the most powerful changes begin with the smallest acts of human kindness, rippling outward until they transform not just individual lives, but entire communities, proving that integrity, courage, and compassion are forces more enduring than wealth, more powerful than position, and more transformative than any privilege money can buy.